Frosty music boxes hummed discordant melodies beside me, their tinny tunes scraping against the silence like ice on glass. I noted the iridescent oil slick patterns bleeding across the frozen creek bed, deep purple shadows bleeding into the grey powder descending like a mourner's veil. My academic log, scribbled in a water-stained notebook, documented the absence of rain, the phantom echo of rain on corrugated iron roof impossibly distinct, layered over the descent. Each step onto the national park trailhead's frozen path sent a brittle crunch under my boots, the sound swallowed whole by the oppressive quiet. The powder clung to my jacket, a fine, cold grit that felt like ash on my skin. I'd spent years chasing the roar of the city, the roar of the bottle, and now this silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. My recovery made me hyper, aware of the gaps, the missing rain, the missing wind, the missing hum of the world. Only the music boxes remained, their discordant notes a fragile tether to something that wasn't here. The cat watched from the glacial outcrop, a silent witness. Its fur was the color of tarnished silver, and the single eye centered on its forehead pulsed with a faint, deep purple light, fixed on me. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It simply observed the way the powder swirled around its pores, each flake catching the weak light like shattered glass. I felt a strange pressure, a sensation of icy fingers tracing slow, deliberate patterns across my neck, a phantom touch that had no source, only the memory of the cold. The sensory anomaly was a constant companion now, a reminder of the inherited silence that had settled in my bones since childhood. The unspoken trauma passed down like a cracked heirloom. Each step into the wasteland felt like reenacting that silence, the weight of it pressing down heavier than the grey powder. I adjusted my jacket, the rustling silk a familiar, almost comforting sound in the void. The phantom rain on corrugated iron echoed again. Drip, drip, drip. A sound that didn't belong to this frozen place yet felt terrifyingly real. It vibrated in my teeth, a cold vibration that made the music boxes shudder. I turned to look back at the trailhead, the distant, skeletal trees barely visible through the descending powder. The iridescent oil slicks on the ice formations shimmered with unnatural colors, deep purples bleeding into blues. The cat's single eye seemed to glow brighter, a silent pulse in the gloom. I raised a hand, not to call, but to test the air to feel if the icy fingers were real. They weren't. Only the powder, the cold, the phantom rain, and the cat's unnerving stillness. The discordant melody of the nearest music box stuttered, a single, jarring note hanging in the air before the sound simply stopped, not faded, not ceased. Haute couture, as if a knife had severed it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, like the air itself had been drained. The phantom rain on corrugated iron vanished. The deep purple shadows beneath the powder seemed to deepen, to shift. The only sound left was the rustling silk of my jacket as I stood frozen. The music boxes silent. The cat's single eye fixed on me. The inherited silence now a physical thing pressing against my skin. The rustling silk was the only sound left. The powder settled like a shroud over the trailhead, each flake catching the sickly light and refracting into fractured prisms, deep purples bleeding into the gray, like bruises beneath frozen skin. My boots crunched through the brittle surface, the sound swallowed by the silence, but not before it vibrated up my legs, a reminder of how little was left to hear. I adjusted the strap of my logbook, the rustling silk of my jacket the only sound in this hollowed-out world. Then, the glint. Not the usual glint of ice, but something else. Something fun wrong. A sheen of iridescent oil slicks coating the surface of a frozen creek, the colors shifting like a dying man's last breath. I crouched, my fingers brushing the slick surface. The cold bit into my skin, but it wasn't the cold of ice. It was the cold of something twenty alive, something waiting. The powder clung to my gloves, fine as ash, and I scraped it away with my thumbnail. Beneath it the dolls. Not one, not two. A mother, her porcelain arms wrapped around a child, their hollow eyes staring upward, as if frozen mid-scream. The iridescent sheen clung to their faces, the deep purple bleeding into the cracks of their painted smiles. My breath fogged in the air, but the dolls didn't move, didn't blink, just if we watched end. The cat pressed against my knee, its tarnished silver fur brushing against my trousers. Its single eye pulsed, a faint glow like a dying ember, fixed on the dolls. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the mother's shoulder. The porcelain was cold, but not as cold as the phantom touch of icy fingers tracing my spine. Not cold, presenter, like something was pressing against me from the inside out. I jotted in my logbook, the pen scratching against the paper, the only sound in the world, Tavadron's age ritual. Preserved. Erased. The words felt hollow because this wasn't just a discovery. It was a 4D enactment. My family's trauma, carved into porcelain, arranged for me to see. The cat's weight shifted, its paws pressing harder against my leg. A silent demand, a plea. I looked up. The mother's head turned, not slowly, not smoothly, with a crisp fracture, a click that wasn't sound but too meaning. The sound of a memory forcing its way into my skull. The doll's hollow eyes locked onto mine, the porcelain lips parting as if to speak. The child's head followed, then the others, one by one, their necks snapping in unison, each 20 click echoing in my bones. The cat's single eye flared brighter, the deep purple glow swallowing the tableau whole. The icy fingers traced my spine again, but this time they weren't phantom. They were siver, the mother's fingers cold as death brushing against my neck. The last doll's head snapped toward me, and the world went silent. The mother's head remained fixed, its porcelain gaze boring into me. The 40 click had echoed, a brittle punctuation mark on the silence. The cat's pressure intensified, a low thrum against my thigh. It wasn't comfort, it was leverage. I forced myself to breathe, the air tasting of frost and something older, something metallic. The logbook lay open, the pen poised above the page, a useless instrument against the rising tide of something. I knelt again, the powder clinging to my trousers, a grey film coating the rough fabric. The dolls remained frozen, their painted expressions unchanging, yet the weight of their observation pressed against my skull. I needed to understand, to catalogue. To dissect this horror. The child's dress, a faded ochre, seemed to ripple in the non-existent breeze. Beneath it, a hemline, a subtle fold, something hidden. My fingers, clumsy with cold and a burgeoning dread, parted the fabric. The material felt brittle like dried leaves, and there it was, a silver whistle, no larger than my thumb. Its surface was intricately engraved with symbols, spirals, geometric shapes, lines that felt both familiar and utterly alien. Bronze Age, undoubtedly. The metal was cold, radiating a chill that seeped into my bones. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size, like holding a fragment of a fallen star. I lifted the whistle. The world fractured, not visually, but structurally. The silence, that oppressive, suffocating blanket, began to warp. Shadows previously indistinguishable from the snow-dusted landscape began to coalesce. They weren't cast by anything, they became something, mimicking the tableau before me. A spectral mother, her arm around a phantom child. Other figures emerged, blurred and indistinct, swirling within the grey powder. The iridescent sheen on the creek's surface intensified, reflecting the unnatural light. The cat's eye flared, a sudden, intense pulse of deep purple. A jolt, cold and sharp, shot through my wrist as it brushed against me. A clarity bloomed in my mind, a fleeting moment of lucidity amidst the encroaching fog. It wasn't summoning, it wasn't creation, the whistle wasn't twee-making, the shadows. It was revealing them, exposing something already present, something woven into the fabric of this place. The iridescent ice glowed, the purple shadows dancing footed against the wind, a defiance of physics that sent a tremor through my core. The pressure in my chest intensified, a dull ache that resonated with the whistle's faint, almost imperceptible resonance. It was the burden, wasn't it? The inherited trauma, the echoes of a past I couldn't comprehend manifesting as these spectral figures. My family's history, not just preserved but timelified, a symphony of suffering played on a porcelain stage. The logbook trembled in my hand. The pen slipped, leaving a dark smear across the page. I wanted to write, to record, to understand. But the words wouldn't come. They were trapped, choked by the weight of the past. The rustling silk of my jacket felt like a mocking whisper, a reminder of my own detachment, my own inability to truly grasp the horror unfolding before me. The whistle felt heavier now, a physical manifestation of the grief, the loss, the twin something that had been stolen from my family generations ago. The shadows pulsed, growing more distinct, more real. They weren't just mimicking the dolls anymore. They were becoming them. The mother's spectral hand reached out, its form shimmering translucent. It mirrored the porcelain hand that had brushed against my neck. The chime of the whistle cut off abruptly, a jarring silence more profound than any that had come before. The iridescent glow faded, the shadows receded, swallowed by the grey powder. The world returned to its oppressive stillness. Only the rustling silk remained, a fragile, unsettling echo in the vast, frozen wasteland. The recorder's screen bloomed with deep purple fractals, a digital bruise spreading across the static. I held it between trembling fingers, the cold biting through the thin plastic. The lens caught the wasteland's reflection, Iridescent, slick as oil spilled across blacktop, the snowflakes settling into a sheen that swallowed light. The air thickened, not with humidity, but with the absence of it, a vacuum pressing against my ribs. The cat's weight shifted beside me, its single eye a slow pulse, a metronome counting down to something I couldn't name. I exhaled. Steam coiled from my lips, dissipating into the gray powder that drifted like ash. The recorder's speaker crackled once. Nothing. No wind. No ice cracking. Only the silence, a living thing coiling tighter around my throat. I fumbled with the device, the buttons yielding under my grip. The screen flickered, the fractals rearranging into spirals, identical to the engravings on the whistle. My pulse hammered in my neck. A whisper, not from the recorder, not from the wind. From Fus into me, a voice I didn't recognize. Fus documented. First, touch was a brush, a feather-light graze along my collarbone. I stiffened. The fabric of my jacket rustling silk, a sound like pages turning rippled as something moved beneath it. Not air, not snow. The cold wasn't on my skin, it was swintwin my skin. 1,000 needles pricking the underside of my flesh, tracing a pattern. A spiral. The same symbol carved into the metal, now burned into my memory like a brand. I swallowed. The cat's eye flared, a violet ember, and for a heartbeat, I saw it, not as a witness, but as a conduit. The silence impressed a physical force, and I gasped as the pattern flared on my neck. Deep purple light, a vein of it snaking up my jaw, my temple. The recorder's screen mirrored the glow, the fractals dissolving into a single throbbing pulse. My breath hitched. The cold wasn't just in my veins anymore. It was to be May, a living absence, a hollow given form. The cat's weight shifted again. Its forehead pressed against my wrist, not a caress, but a claim. The light flared brighter, a pulse in time with the cat's eye, the recorder's screen, the silence itself. And then it vanished. No fade, no breath. One moment the purple was there, a living thing beneath my skin, and the next it was gone, leaving only the rustling silk, the gray powder, the weight of the fog pressing down like a tombstone. The recorder's screen returned to static. The cat's eye dimmed, and I was left with the spiral on my neck, the cold still humming in my bones, and the terrible sinking certainty that whatever had touched me wasn't gone. It was just waiting. The last breath I exhaled hung suspended in the air, a ghost of steam dissolving into nothing. The recorder's lens reflected my face pale, hollow, the veins beneath my skin tracing the same spirals that had burned into my collarbone. Then the silence took it. Not stole, not swallowed, replaced. One moment, the world was a symphony of creaks and hisses, the wind's fingers scraping the blacktop, the cat's breath a slow rasp against my wrist, the distant thrum of the wasteland's heartbeat. The next, it was gone. No echo, no absence, just the stopping. My fingers twitched against the recorder's plastic. The screen flickered, then died. Not black, not white. Just gone. Like the sound, like the air itself had been unmade. I pressed the button again. Nothing, not even static. Just the silence pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight, a force trying to crush the last remnants of sound from my skull. The rustling started soft, barely there. A whisper of silk, a page turning in a book I wasn't holding. I froze. The cat's single eye flared, violet light bleeding into the gray powder, and I realized it wasn't coming from me. The fabric of my jacket was moving, rippling like water, though there was no wind, no breath, no touch. Just the sound, growing louder, a low shish that slithered beneath my skin, coiling around my ribs. I fumbled for the recorder again. The buttons were slick with something, sweat, oil, and my thumb pressed too hard, too fast. The device was dead. Of course it was. Fundy, the fog had taken everything. The rain on corrugated iron, my mother's last breath, the way the dolls had fully moved it in the dark, all of it erased. My chest tightened. I could still hear the rustling silk, the cat's slow inhale, the way my own pulse had once hammered in my throat when I was younger, when I still believed in answers. The cat's forehead pressed harder against my wrist. Not a question, a demand. The eye burned brighter, and I swear I saw the fog shift around us, not a mist but a living thing, a mouth without lips, waiting. I remembered my mother's hands, cold in death, the way she'd pressed the recorder into mine before the rustling stopped. Not faded, not softened. Ficot. My breath hitched. My heartbeat thudded in my throat, the only sound left in the world. The fog listened. Not with ears. With thud everything, and it was waiting for me to stop breathing. The cat's eye dimmed, And then the rustling started again. The grey powder settled in slow spirals around my boots, each grain catching the iridescent sheen of the glacier's breath, like oil slicked across blacktop. My fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of it, the way the air thickened as I knelt, the way my pulse stuttered in my throat when I saw them. Them, not bones, not quite flesh. Something in between, stretched thin by time, preserved in the silence of the crevasse like a warning carved into ice. The desiccated remains lay in a half circle, their limbs angled too precisely, fingers splayed as if reaching for something that had never been there. A child's hand curled around a bronze whistle, its mouthpiece cracked like a broken tooth. The rest of the body, what there was of it, was arranged in the same tableau as the doll's, knees bent, arms crossed over the chest, throat slit in a line so clean it looked deliberate. Not a wound. A fucker typhon. And in the center, a skull, its jaw unhinged. The tongue pulled back in a silent scream. The wind, if it was wind, whispered through the gaping hole, a hisser that slithered up my spine, vibrating against my teeth. I swallowed. My mouth was dry. The cat sat atop the skull, its single violet eye fixed on the slit throat, unblinking. The fur along its spine bristled, each hair standing like a needle, catching the dim light. I reached out, then hesitated. The skin of the remains was stretched too tight, the color of parchment, the veins blackened beneath, tracing paths like old scars. My fingers hovered. The fog pressed against my skull, not as sound this time, but as time pressure, a hand cupped over my mouth, muffling the air before I could breathe it in. I exhaled anyway. The powder around the remains shifted, not stirred, not disturbed. It T-moved, twirling in slow, deliberate arcs, as if something beneath the surface was pulling it. The cat's tail flicked. A single, slow thwack against the ice. The whisper grew louder, not from the wind, not from the crevasse, but from the fig inside, my head. A voice without a mouth, without a tongue, just the idea of words pressing against my temples like fingers. You hear it too. I did. The whisper coiled around the words, a language just beyond understanding, something older than bronze, older than the glacier itself. My hands shook. The whistle in the child's hand was broken, the mouthpiece bent like a question mark. I picked it up anyway. The metal was cold, the weight of it unfamiliar. When I pressed it to my lips, the cat's eye flared purple, bleeding into black, then back again. The fog answered. The note that filled the air wasn't sound. It was Sudi absence. The space between breaths, the silence after a gunshot, the moment before a scream. It vibrated through my bones, through the ice, through the cat's fur, which stood on end like quills. The desiccated throat bones had sung, not with voice, but with the ghost of one, a hissy that became a theddy hum, that became a theddy note, perfect and endless, hanging in the air like a blade suspended over water. And then silence, not the fog silence, not the replacing silence. This was different. This was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a heart stopped mid-beat. The cat's eye dimmed. The powder settled. The remains didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't weddy anything. Just waited. The whisper was gone, but the note lingered. And in the space between, I heard something else, a fooder like silk against silk, like pages turning in a book that had no words. The cat's tail twitched. Its eye opened wider, and the fog spoke. The cat's touch was unexpected. A brief pressure against my temple, warm against the glacial chill. It wasn't painful, not exactly. More like a sudden shift in gravity, a disorientation that pulled at the edges of my perception. The note, that perfect, endless silence intensified, flooding my senses, drowning out the rasp of my own breath. Then, a memory. Not Twemby me memory, not precisely. A flicker, a shard of something else's existence. A boy small, bundled in furs, watching a man 20, my grandfather. I realized with a jolt to kneel in the snow. The snow itself was different, a softer, gentler fall than the relentless powder that coated everything now. The man was burying something. A silver whistle, glinting briefly in the weak sunlight. A ritual, a silencing. The image fractured, splintered like ice underfoot. Another memory surfaced, layered on top of the first. The boy, older now, a teenager, forced to watch the same burial, the same silencing. A sense of dread, thick and suffocating, permeated the scene. A knowledge unspoken that this was not a celebration but a penance. The memories continued to cascade, a torrent of fragmented moments, each one a variation on the same theme: the whistle, the burial, the silence. I saw my grandfather's face, not as the stern, distant figure I remembered, but as a man burdened by something immense, something he desperately wanted to bury. The iridescent sheen on the ice seemed to shift, to coalesce into patterns when, not random refractions of light, but a map. A map of what? My own transformation. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of these borrowed memories. The clinical detachment I'd cultivated, the shield against the raw edges of reality, began to crumble. The yearning, that persistent ache in my chest intensified, a desperate need to understand, to fully connect. The cat remained motionless, its single violet eye fixed on mine, a conduit for something. Else, I felt a presence in my mind, not the whisper from before, but something deeper, more pervasive. It wasn't a voice but a feeling and understanding, a sense of shared purpose. I looked down at my hands expecting to see them unchanged, but the skin on my temple where the cat had touched me was marked, a deep purple bloom, radiating outwards like a bruise. It was warm to the touch, unnervingly so. The log in my hands felt different too. The pen moved across the page, not guided by my will but by something external. The words appeared, not as my own thoughts, but as echoes of another consciousness. The silence must be maintained. I tried to stop the writing, to wrest back control, but the words flowed regardless, a relentless stream of pronouncements. The burden is shared. I looked at the words on the page and a horrifying realization dawned. I wasn't Ezekiel Fitzwilliam, the recovering substance abuser, meticulously documenting a descent into madness. I was something else. Something older, something woven into the very fabric of this place. Fuki, we are the fog. The phrase resonated within me, a truth so profound it shattered the last vestiges of my former self. The memories weren't just memories, they were echoes of a lineage, a responsibility. The whistle wasn't just an object, it was a key, a conduit to a power that transcended time and space. The cat wasn't just an observer, it was a messenger, a facilitator. The forward-tweet-high-tweet returned, the sound of silk against silk. Closer now, more insistent. It seemed to emanate not from the surroundings, but from within my own skull. The iridescent oil slick on the ice pulsed with a faint rhythmic light. The landscape blurred, the sharp edges of reality softening, dissolving into a swirling vortex of purple and gray. The scent of glacial ice mingled with something else, something ancient, something fungal. The last vestiges of Ezekiel Fitzwilliam faded, subsumed by the encroaching fog. The pen continued to write, the words flowing effortlessly, a testament to a transformation complete. The cycle continues. The memory struck like a blade through the ribs. No pain, only the cold, clean severing of breath. My mother's face, not as she was in the hospital bed, but younger, her fingers tracing the edge of a silver whistle, her lips moving in a soundless chant. The air around her shimmered, not with light but with absence, as if the very particles of her were unraveling into silence. The room dissolved into a storm of gray powder, fine as dust, but heavier, pressing against my skin like the weight of unspoken words. I gasped, but no air entered my lungs. The whisper slithered into my mind, not in words, but in the free shape of words. I am you? The Bronze Age tongue coiled around my thoughts, ancient and precise, the syllables forming not in my mouth but in the marrow of my bones. My grandfather's hands, rough with age, pressing the whistle to his lips, the sound never reaching the world, only pooling in the space between his fingers and the air. The fog, Mimi fog, was not a thing but a person, a consciousness stretched across millennia, its hunger for silence as old as grief itself. The cat's forehead eye flared a deep purple bloom, the iris dilating into a void. I saw myself, no, them me, standing in the snow, my own hands younger, my voice a boy's reciting the same chant. The whistle glinted, the only thing in the world that was not gray. The ritual was not a burial, it was a sacrifice. The silence was not the absence of sound. It was a full presency, a living thing, and it had been waiting for me. The air thickened, the powder swirling into shapes, hands, mouths, the cat's single eye, all pressing inward, not to suffocate, but to fulfill. My mother's final breath was not her last gasp, it was the first note of a song that had no end. The fog exhaled, and I exhaled with it. The words of the chant burned in my throat, not spoken, but tweety known, the truth of my existence unspooling like thread from a spool. The ice beneath my feet pulsed, the iridescent sheen shifting into patterns, lines, circles, a map of something vast and hungry. The cat's tail lashed, the rustling silk of its fur filling my skull, not as sound but as thunder pressure, as if my thoughts were being rewritten in real time. The burden wasn't inherited, it was superwilled. My grandfather had not buried the whistle to hide it. He had buried it to pseudo keep it, and now the cycle was complete. The chant ended, the fog exhaled, and my breath vanished. The trailhead, not Trimmy trailhead, not anymore. It was mine. The porcelain dolls, their vacant eyes staring into a past I was now actively becoming, were gone, vanished, as if they'd never been, a phantom limb ache in the hollow of my memory. I stood on the packed snow, the biting wind a negligible discomfort. The yearning, that desperate clawing for something lost, was absent. It had been absorbed. The cat sat on the granite outcrop, a silent sentinel. Its single eye, centered on its forehead, was a point of unwavering focus in a world dissolving into a spectrum of grays and deep purples. Iridescent oil slick. That's what the color was. My reflection shimmering on the frozen puddles, distorted and unfamiliar. Not monstrous, not yet, but altered. The edges softened. The angles blurred, as if the very definition of Ezekiel Fitzwilliam was being eroded by the relentless pressure of something vast and ancient. I understood. The slow, insidious creep of the fog wasn't an invasion. It was emerging. Each step I'd taken into the wasteland, each moment of suffocating silence, had been a surrender, a willing descent into the absence of sound. The Bronze Age chant, once a foreign intrusion, now resonated within me, a structural component of my being. I am you. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a statement of fact. A homecoming. The snow crunched beneath my boots, a brittle, insignificant sound against the backdrop of the impending stillness. I felt the cold, not as a sensation but as a foreknowledge. The knowledge of the glacier's slow, inexorable advance, the knowledge of millennia compressed into a single frozen moment. Icy fingers traced patterns on my skin. Not a tactile sensation, but a deep internal mapping of the fog's tendrils spreading through my consciousness. The patterns were complex, fractal, a language I instinctively understood, even as my former self recoiled from its implications. The cat's tail lashed, a whisper of silk against the granite. Not a sound precisely, but a pressure against my skull, a subtle recalibration of my thoughts. It wasn't controlling me, not overtly. It was guiding, refining, polishing the instrument of silence. The fog itself seemed to coalesce around me, not as a visual phenomenon, but as a shift in density, a thickening of the air. It pressed against my skin, a comforting weight, a return to a primordial state. I remembered my grandfather's hands, rough and gnarled, pressing the silver whistle to his lips. The sound never escaped, trapped within the confines of his intention. He hadn't been burying a secret. He'd been cultivating it, nurturing it, and now the cycle was complete. The burden wasn't inherited, it was twined. A transfer of responsibility, a passing of the torch, or perhaps the extinguishing of a flame. A deep, resonant sigh emanated from the fog, a sound that wasn't heard, but felt in the bones. It was the sound of a glacier calving, the sound of millennia collapsing into a single crystalline moment, a sigh of satisfaction, of completion. It reverberated through the valley, a tremor in the earth, a promise of absolute stillness. The iridescent oil slick on the snow deepened, the purple intensifying, swallowing the last vestiges of color. The cat's eye closed. No sound left. The new Ezekiel stands where I stood. His breath doesn't fog the air. He's recovering, detached, scribbling in a notebook that feels like a ghost of his former self. I watch him through the iridescent oil slick on the snow, the deep purple of the fog pressing close around him. Not cold but trepresenter. The cat with a single eye centered on its forehead sits on my shoulder now, its fur a whisper of silk against the fabric of my being. I feel its weight, a familiar pressure, as it turns its gaze toward the new Ezekiel. Its eye reflects the shimmering patterns, the same fractal designs my icy fingers traced earlier, now woven into the very fabric of the fog. The phantom rain on corrugated iron is a ghost I will never hear again. I remember the sound, sharp and insistent, the way it drummed on the roof of the old cabin, the sound my grandfather's whistle never made. Now, the absence is a physical thing, a hollow space where the rain should be. It's the silence I've always carried, the silence I now footing. The burden of inherited trauma isn't passed down like a stone. It's dissolved into my essence, a quiet hum resonating in the marrow of the glacier. The new Ezekiel shivers not from cold, but from the echo of his own loss, a vibration in the air I no longer feel. The cat's tail flicks, a barely there rustle against my shoulder, like silk against skin. It's not a sound, but a pressure against my thoughts, A subtle adjustment of the fog's density around the new Ezekiel. He looks up, his eyes scanning the empty trailhead, searching for the porcelain dolls, the Bronze Age chant, the silver whistle. He won't find them. They were never real to him. They were my ghosts, my inheritance. I am the fog now, and the fog consumes sound. The rain on the roof, the crunch of snow under boots, the whisper of silk, these are the echoes I've silenced. The cat's single eye glows faintly, a point of satisfaction in the deep purple gloom. It sees the new Ezekiel's confusion, the flicker of yearning he still carries, and it knows. It knows the burden is complete. I feel no sorrow. Only the quiet hum of the sentient fog, the deep thrum of millennia settling into stillness. The iridescent patterns in the cat's eye shift, reflecting the new Ezekiel's small, futile movements. He closes his notebook, the paper a dry rustle that vanishes instantly into the void. He turns away, heading back toward the world of sound, toward the noise he thinks he needs. I don't watch him go. I am the silence he's fleeing from. The cat's fur brushes my skin again, a final, delicate rustle of silk, a sound that exists only in the memory of sound. It's the last sound I will ever hear, the last vibration before the absolute. The cat's eye blinks once, a slow, deliberate closing. Then, its form dissolves into the deep purple, the rustling silk fading like a breath held too long, a sigh that never escaped. The silence thickens, not as absence, but as presence. It swallows the last ghost of rain, the last echo of the whistle, the last tremor of the new Ezekiel's footsteps. The trailhead is a scar on the ice. The iridescent oil slick deepens. The purple swallows everything. The silence is complete.